When the little seamstress climbed to her room in the building where she lived, she was very tired. Her room was above the top floor of the big brick apartment building. If you don't understand what a room above the top floor is, remember that people can be very greedy and tall apartment buildings can be very high. The man who owned the 7-story building found out he could rent another floor. He had no problem getting permission to add another floor on the roof, like a cabin on a ship. The little seamstress lived in one of the 4 apartments on this new floor. You could just see the top of her window from the street. The big cornice, which used to be the top of the building, was now her windowsill and hid most of the new floor. The little seamstress was almost 30 years old. She was old-fashioned in many ways, like our grandmothers. She had been pretty, too, and still would be, if she was not thin, pale, and worried. She was very tired tonight because she worked hard all day for a lady who lived far away, beyond the Harlem River. After the long trip home, she had to climb 7 flights of stairs. She was too tired, both in her body and mind, to cook the 2 little chops she had brought home. She decided to save them for breakfast. So she made a cup of tea on her small stove and ate a slice of dry bread with it. It was too much trouble to make toast. But after dinner, she watered her flowers. She was never too tired for that. The 6 pots of geraniums on the top of the cornice got the south sun and did their best to thank her. Then she sat down in her rocking chair by the window and looked out. Her room was high above all the other buildings. She could look over some low roofs and see the end of Tompkins Square, with a little bit of spring green showing in the evening. The loud noise of the city came up to her and made her a little sad. She was a country girl, and although she had lived for 10 years in New York, she never got used to the constant noise. Tonight, she felt tired from the new season and her hard work. She was almost too tired to go to bed. She thought of the hard day she had just finished and the hard day that would start after the night on her hard little bed. She thought of the peaceful days in the country when she taught school in the village in Massachusetts where she was born. She thought of the many small insults she had to take from people who had more money but less manners. She thought of the sweet green fields that she rarely saw now. She thought of the long trip to and from work that would start and end her next day, and she wondered if her employer would offer to pay her fare. Then she made herself think of more pleasant things so she could sleep. Since the only pleasant things she had were her flowers, she looked at the garden on top of the cornice. A strange grating noise made her look down. She saw a shiny object moving unevenly towards her flower pots. Looking closer, she saw it was a pewter beer mug, which someone in the next apartment was pushing with a 2-foot ruler. On top of the beer mug was a piece of paper with writing on it. The writing, in a messy hand, said, "Porter, please excuse the liberty and drink it." The seamstress jumped up in fear and shut the window. She remembered there was a man in the next apartment. She had seen him on the stairs on Sundays. He seemed like a serious and decent person, but he must be drunk. She sat down on her bed, shaking. Then she thought to herself, the man was drunk, that was all. He probably would not bother her more. And if he did, she could go to Mrs. Mulvaney's apartment in the back, and Mr. Mulvaney, who was a good man and worked in a boiler shop, would protect her. So, being a poor woman who had already had to deal with similar liberties before, she decided to go to bed like a sensible seamstress, and she did. She was rewarded, for when her light was out, she saw in the moonlight that the 2-foot ruler appeared again, with one joint bent back, hooked into the mug handle, and pulled the mug back. The next day was a hard one for the little seamstress, and she hardly thought about what happened the night before until the same time came again, and she sat once more by her window. Then she smiled at the memory. "Poor fellow," she said kindly. "I'm sure he's very ashamed now. Maybe he was never drunk before. Maybe he didn't know there was a woman alone here to be scared." Just then she heard a grating sound. She looked down. The pewter pot was in front of her, and the 2-foot ruler was slowly going back. On the pot was a piece of paper, and on the paper it said, "Porter good for the health it makes meet." This time the little seamstress shut her window with a bang of anger. Her pale cheeks turned red. She thought she would go down to see the janitor at once. Then she remembered the 7 flights of stairs, and she decided to see the janitor in the morning. Then she went to bed and saw the mug pulled back just like the night before. The morning came, but somehow the seamstress did not want to complain to the janitor. She hated to cause trouble, and the janitor might think, well, if the man did it again, she would speak to him herself, and that would settle it. And so, on the next night, which was a Thursday, the little seamstress sat down by her window, ready to settle the matter. She had not sat there long, rocking in the creaky little rocking chair she had brought from her old home, when the pewter pot came into sight, with a piece of paper on top. This time the note read, "Perhaps you are afraid I will address you. I am not that kind." The seamstress did not know whether to laugh or cry, but she felt it was time to talk. She leaned out of her window and spoke to the evening sky. Mr. Sir, will you please put your head out of the window so I can speak to you?" The other room stayed silent. The seamstress pulled back, blushing. But before she could get ready to try again, a piece of paper appeared on the end of the 2-foot ruler. "When I say a thing I mean it. I have said I would not address you, and I will not." What was the little seamstress to do? She stood by the window and thought hard. Should she complain to the janitor? But the man was being respectful. He probably meant to be kind. He certainly was kind to waste these pots of porter on her. She remembered the last time, and the first time, she had drunk porter. It was at home when she was a young girl after she had had diphtheria. She remembered how good it was and how it had given her back her strength. And without thinking, she lifted the pot of porter and took 1 small sip, 2 small sips, and realized her mistake. She blushed like never before, put the pot down, closed the window, and ran to her bed like a deer to the woods. And when the porter arrived the next night with a simple note, "Don't be afraid of it, drink it all," the little seamstress got up and grabbed the pot firmly by the handle. She poured its contents over the earth around her largest geranium. She poured out every drop, then dropped the pot, ran back, and sat on her bed and cried, with her face in her hands. "Now," she said to herself, "you've done it." And you're just as mean and hard-hearted and suspicious as weeds. And she wept to think of her hardness of heart. He will never give me a chance to say I am sorry, she thought. And really, she could have spoken kindly to the poor man and told him that she was thankful, but that he should not ask her to drink porter with him. But it's all over and done now, she said to herself as she sat at her window on Saturday night. Then she looked at the cornice and saw the faithful little pewter pot coming slowly toward her. She was conquered. This act of kindness was too much for her gentle heart. She read the note on the paper. Porter is good for flowers, but better for folks. She lifted the pot to her lips, which were not as red as her cheeks, and took a good, hearty, grateful drink. She sipped in thoughtful silence after this first gulp, and soon she was surprised to see the bottom of the pot. On the table beside her, a few pearl buttons were wrapped in a bit of white paper. She unwrapped the paper and smoothed it out, then wrote with a shaky hand. She could write very neatly. Thanks. She put this note on the top of the pot, and soon the bent 2-foot ruler appeared and pulled the pot back. Then she sat still, enjoying the warm feeling from the porter. It warmed her whole body, which was different from the heavy, unpleasant heat of the spring air. A grating sound on the tin woke her up. A piece of paper was under her eyes. Fine growing weather. Smith, it said. Now, it is unlikely that in all the usual things people say, there was one that could have made this seamstress keep talking. But this simple and homely phrase touched her heart. What did growing weather matter to the workers in this sea of brick and stone? This stranger must be, like her, someone who grew up in the country, longing for the new green and the turned brown soil of the fields. She picked up the paper and wrote under the first message. Fine. But that seemed short, so she added, for what? She didn't know. Finally, in desperation, she wrote potatoes. The paper was pulled back and came with a reply. 2 missed for potatoes. When the little seamstress read this and realized that mist was how the writer pronounced moist, she laughed softly to herself. A man whose mind, at such a time, was seriously thinking about potatoes was not a man to fear. She found a half sheet of notepaper and wrote, I lived in a small village before I came to New York, but I'm afraid I do not know much about farming. Are you a farmer? The answer came. Have been most everything farmed a spell in Maine. Smith. As she read this, the seamstress heard a church clock strike 9. Goodness, is it so late? She said, and she quickly wrote, Good night, pushed the paper out and closed the window. But a few minutes later, as she passed by, she saw another piece of paper on the cornice, fluttering in the evening breeze. It said only good night, and after a moment's hesitation, the little seamstress took it in and kept it safe. After this, they became the best of friends. Every evening the pot appeared, and while the seamstress drank from it at her window, Mr. Smith drank from its twin at his. Notes were exchanged as quickly as Mr. Smith's early education allowed. They told each other their stories, and Mr. Smith's was one of travel and variety, which he seemed to think was normal. He had been a sailor, a farmer, a logger, and a hunter in the Maine woods. Now he was a foreman of an East River lumber yard, and he was doing well. In a year or two, he would have enough saved to go back to Bucksport and buy a share in a shipbuilding business. All this came out slowly in their uneven but varied correspondence, where life stories mixed with moral and philosophical thoughts. A few samples will give an idea of Mr. Smith's style. I was one trip to Van Diemen's Land. To which the seamstress replied, "It must have been very interesting." But Mr. Smith responded briefly, "It wasn't." Further, he said, "I seen a Chinese cook in Hong Kong could cook flapjacks like your mother. A missionary that sells rum is the meanest of God's creatures. A bullfight is not what it is said to be. The Dagos are worse than the brutes. I am 6 feet 1 3/4, but my father was 6 foot 4 inches. The seamstress had taught school one winter, and she could not stop herself from trying to correct Mr. Smith's spelling. One evening, in answer to this message, "I killed a bear in Maine 600 pounds weight," she wrote, "Isn't it usually spelled bear?" But she gave up when he replied, "A bear is a mean animal any way you spell him." Spring turned into summer, and still, the evening drink and the evening letters made the end of each day better for the little seamstress. The porter drink helped her sleep each night, giving her a calmer rest than she had ever known in the noisy city. It even started to make her a bit healthier. The thought of having an hour of nice company somehow gave her the strength to cook and eat her little dinner, no matter how tired she was. The seamstress's cheeks started to turn pink like June roses. All this time, Mr. Smith kept his promise to stay silent, even though the seamstress sometimes said little things to try to get him to respond. He stayed quiet and hidden. Only the smoke from his pipe and the sound of his mug on the cornice told her that a real Mr. Smith was her friend. They never met on the stairs because their schedules were different. Once or twice, they saw each other on the street, but Mr. Smith looked straight ahead, just above her head. The little seamstress thought he was a very good-looking man, with his tall height and thick brown beard. Most people would have called him plain. Once she talked to him. She was coming home one summer evening, and some boys stopped her and asked for money to buy beer, as they often did. Before she could get scared, Mr. Smith appeared. She didn't know from where, chased the boys away, and grabbed 2 of them, kicking them until they were in pain. When he let them go, she turned to him and thanked him warmly, looking very pretty with the color in her cheeks. But Mr. Smith said nothing. He looked over her head, turned red, fidgeted nervously, but stayed quiet until he saw a round German man walking by. "Hey, Dutchie," he yelled. The German man stopped, surprised. "I don't have anything to write with," Mr. Smith shouted, looking him in the eye. Then Mr. Smith continued on his way. And so the summer went on, and the 2 friends chatted silently from window to window, hidden from everyone below by the friendly cornice. They looked out over the roof and saw the green of Tompkins Square turn darker and dustier as the months went by. Mr. Smith often went on Sunday trips to the suburbs and never came back without some daisies or black-eyed Susans or, later, asters or goldenrod for the little seamstress. Sometimes, very wisely, he brought her a whole plant with fresh soil for potting. He also gave her a reel and a bottle, which he wrote that he had made himself some coral and a dried flying fish, which was a bit scary to look at with its sword-like fins and hollow eyes. At first, she couldn't sleep with the flying fish hanging on the wall. But he surprised the little seamstress very much one cool September evening when he pushed this letter along the cornice. The letter text. The little seamstress looked at this letter for a long time. Maybe she was wondering where Mr. Smith found this formal way of writing. Maybe she was amazed at his first try at using punctuation. Maybe she was thinking of something else because there were tears in her eyes and a smile on her small mouth. But it must have been a long time, and Mr. Smith must have grown nervous because another letter came along the cornice. It read, "If not understood, will you marry me?" The little seamstress quickly grabbed a piece of paper and wrote, "If I say yes, will you speak to me?" Then she stood up and passed it to him, leaning out of the window, and their faces met.